you were interested in working in the archives?
So up until then, I'm not sure exactly what I thought I was going to do when I finished the program in Madurai. I certainly wanted to come, to Pondicherry, but I hadn't entirely ruled out Auroville at that stage. I also didn't know much about Auroville, actually, except the ideal. But as soon as the opportunity to work in the archives presented itself, that seemed to be the inevitable thing, because my whole life up until then had really been a preparation for the work which I've been doing now since 1980 in the archives, deliberately or otherwise. Some of it quite deliberate, my study of languages and so on. I was very well prepared for the work in the archives.
And this has been a period of 34 years.
Yes, that's true.
Oh.
That's true. It's 34 years.
Quite.
At first I was asked to work specifically on a project which never was quite finished, which was a Vedic glossary. That ended up being a huge project, which I think I'll come back to someday. Purani had written,
Yes,
of course,
yes.
a rough glossary of the Veda, but it didn't use Sri Aurobindo's unpublished Vedic writings, which are only now coming out. I'm just now, as a matter of fact, beginning the final proofreading of a volume called Vedic and Philological Studies, which will complete the Vedic series in the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. So there will be 3 volumes now of Sri Aurobindo's writings on the Veda. But in 1980, his unpublished Vedic translations were known. Some of them had come out in the Archives and Research Journal, which was already being published at that time. Many of them had not. But work was on the Vedic glossary, of revising Purani's glossary, had begun. And so the first thing I was asked to do was to continue with that work, and that included the unpublished Vedic translations by Sri Aurobindo, which had been typed up. So I was given that work, but it proved to be a huge project. And meanwhile, I was starting to do other work for the archives, reading of other books that were being prepared, new editions of, for example, there was an idea of bringing out a volume of his writings on Kalidasa. That was the first thing I was asked to work on. That also didn't actually materialize in the expected form right away, but it was the way I was introduced to the work in the archives was I was asked to do some reading of Kalidasa, which, given my background, was an obvious choice. I had meanwhile finished my translation of The Cloud Messenger, and it had been published in Mother India, so Kalidasa was an obvious fit for me. So that was, I think, my first work of reading Sri Aurobindo's manuscripts. Not so much the manuscripts, but at least because, for example, the Hero and the Nymph had been published in collected poems and plays, but in any case there was a process of checking.
At that time, what was your deepest interest in Sri Aurobindo's works?
At that stage, it was becoming Savitri. It's hard to say exactly at what stage Savitri began to become the most important work Sri Aurobindo's for me. I had begun with the Life Divine, but almost simultaneously I had started to read Savitri. And I'm not sure how much I understood of the Life Divine when I was 18, but at least I got through it. I don't remember even how far I got with Savitri. I don't think I got past the first part. But I do remember just having this feeling that it was something wonderful, which I didn't necessarily understand, but just this sense of the dawn, in the opening canto, was something which was quite overpowering from my very first reading of Savitri. But I became more and more drawn to Savitri. I just remember, sort of images from the 70s of, being on a trip somewhere, and I remember that I had Savitri with me, and that was what I was reading. And I was starting to memorize passages from Savitri at that time. It just seemed the natural thing. Around the same time, I memorized the Gita in Sanskrit. I don't remember where I got the idea of doing that, but I did. I think around 1978, I memorized the whole of the Gita in Sanskrit. And around that time, I remember I was thinking that Savitri would be a good thing to memorize in the same way. I think partly because of my musical background, memorization came naturally as a pianist. I had given a recital by heart at the age of 18, which means you have to develop a pretty good memory for that. And even when I had mentioned my year in Switzerland, when I was 12, I had learned a fairly long poem by Schiller in German. And I hadn't understood all the words, but this was an interesting experience because when I didn't understand the words, I got the meaning, a sense of the meaning from the sound of the words. And this was my first exposure really to how poetry differs from prose and how sound is important in poetry. It was through German poetry because it wasn't my own language. And I had memorized this whole, it was about a 5-page poem by Schiller called Die Bürgschaft. I can still remember. I can still recite the.
Well, at the end, I'm going to ask you to recite some Savitri, but not
I
Schiller.
don't know. I don't know. Actually, I
A
have
few lines, perhaps. So you became deep
Savitri,
deeper
and then in 1983, it was actually quite early in my time in the archives, I was asked to read the manuscripts of Savitri. And that went for 2 years. It took me 2 years to do a complete reading of the manuscripts of Savitri, and which eventually, it was a long process, but that led to the edition that came out in 1993. And
well, I do remember once sending you a list of 34 questions where I had questions about certain words or lines in Savitri. And I think I waited 3 years, and you
Really?
came to me one
Oh
day
my God.
and you said, I have all your answers. And he answered
I don't remember.
every question I had. Every question fully answered. I had no more questions. Anyway, thank you.
Sure. I had sent a question like that to Amal just before I came on my final trip to India in '79, and I had raised a doubt about a word which turned out to be in a dictated line. The manuscript had been checked and it had been discovered because I had read an article in Mother India about a particular line in Savitri, master of nature who once her bond slave worked,
Yes.
where once had been misheard by Nirodha as wants.
W-A-N-T-S.
W-A-N-T-S.
Instead of
which
O-N-C-E.
didn't make any sense.
Yes, of
And,
course.
and a mathematics professor at the University of Oregon, I think, had written to Amal, pointing out this. This is the way I remember it, at least.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was checked, and it was found that it was a dictated line, and it was obviously misheard.
Yes.
And I had noticed something similar, and I sent it to Amal, and they went through a similar process. And so that was my first exposure to the idea of editions of Savitri. I became aware that there were different editions, and what was done, when there was a doubt about the reading of the text, that you look at the manuscript.
Yes.
Of course, there was this special situation in the case of the dictated lines, which required special treatment because of the possibility of
Human error.
human error.
Yes.
This all led to my coming into quite close contact with Nirodha, of course, whom I hadn't met in the very
Previously.
beginning. I don't remember when I first met him. I think I must have first been introduced to Nirodha when I was at one of my many visits to Amal. So I had met him but hadn't had very close contact with him. Then I ended up being involved in a series of meetings with Nirodha and Amal, and got to know them very well. I also, during that period, I helped Amal revise his one of his books, The Problem of Aryan Origins, is it called? The second edition, which he greatly expanded. And so I developed a quite close relationship with those two at that time. They were really the only, of course then when I moved into Golkand after 1982, I came to know Udar very well. Not immediately, but fairly shortly.
But with the two of them, your work was on Savitri.
My work
I
was
take it mostly.
My work was mostly on Savitri. I shared other interests with Amal particularly, but the work was mostly on Savitri, and that was how I had the close contact with them.
And then in the case of 16 drafts of the first canto, Book 1, for example, how did you approach that? I mean,
actually,
were there photocopies made?
At that time, it was through photocopies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, I had access to the original manuscripts in cold storage during this period. Now we no longer bring the manuscripts out of cold storage. In those days, manuscripts were being brought out of cold storage to the archives in the early 80s. We didn't do the work in cold storage on Savitri, for example. The work, a couple of years that I spent reading the manuscripts, they were brought out to the archives. Now we only bring scans of the manuscripts out of cold storage, and but there was an intermediate stage when we made a transition to working mostly with photocopies to avoid exposing the manuscripts to the tropical climate once they had been put in cold storage. So you had asked about Nadkarni. Nadkarni came into the picture a little bit later. I remember that Nirodha came to the archives once with Nadkarni. I don't remember when that was exactly. Sometime in the 1990s. Do you remember when Nadkarni started to give his talks?
No, I knew him in Los Angeles when he was studying linguistics.
95, okay.
Yeah.
So this would have been the later 90s that I first met Nadkarni. I didn't immediately have any further um, contact with him, and I wasn't in the early days attending his talks. But in 1999, I was asked to give a talk at the Savitri Bhavan, which was the first time that I spoke about the composition of Savitri, the process of the writing of Savitri. And that then I was, a few months later, Deshpande asked me to expand that a little bit for publication in Mother India.
He was at the time editor,
Yeah.
yes.
And so this was I think this must have been, or maybe the talk at Savitri Bhavan was, it must have been November 1998. And because it was in 1999 that I started my series of articles in Savitri on the composition of Savitri in Mother India, that was intended to be a little bit of an expanded version of the talk which had been published in Invocation, the transcript of my talk at the Savitri Bhavan, when I had just sort of started talking and rambled on until it was lunchtime and I was asked to stop. My articles were again sort of the same story. I wrote one article and then a second one, and it kept going on, and eventually it turned into a series of 50 articles, which was an interesting experience from the point of view of my connection with Sri Aurobindo's writings, because he published most of his major works serially, his prose works.
Yes.
And so I had this experience of what it's like. And I discovered how difficult it is to write something serially with any kind of a coherent plan to it. I ended up writing a series of articles which had no coherent plan overall, although there were sections of it where I managed to, maintain some kind of control, for a few months in a row, but it kept getting sort of out of hand and expanding more and more in ways I hadn't intended. And this made me realize how extraordinary the Arya was, because not only did Sri Aurobindo write 5 or 6 books at one time in the Arya, but he was very conscious of his readership, the subscribers.
Yes.
He was very considerate toward the subscribers to the Arya who subscribed 1 year at a time. So he would try to end a series in the July issue, because the Arya had started, of course, in August 1914, so each year of the Arya ended in July. In 1 year, he ended simultaneously the first series of essays on the Gita, the ideal of human unity, and the psychology of social development, which he was later renamed the human cycle, at the same time. And how he did that is absolutely beyond me, because each one has its own logical development, its own architecture. It's hard to see how you could speed up or slow down very much the process of the development of those 3 books. But it was like, it was like a Bach fugue or something like that on a massive scale, that he had these separate, but not a fugue with just one theme. But anyway, he was doing all of this simultaneously. And the experience of serial publication made me appreciate this feat of what Aurobindo did in the Arya, which was, simply superhuman. In any case, so I started publishing the articles on Savitri. Then Nadkarni became very interested at a certain point, because he was reading my articles, and that's how I really got to have a close association with Nadkarni. At one point, he started asking me to come to his house to read Savitri, Um, that was towards the end of his life. Meanwhile, I had started going to hear his talks on Savitri whenever I could. They were during working hours, and so I couldn't attend all of them by any means. But I had come to appreciate Nadkarni's talks, and particularly what was important for me in my association with Nadkarni was not actually so much in connection with Savitri. He encouraged me, of course, in my work on Savitri, and I encouraged him in his talks. But what I noticed was that he always at least began his series of talks by relating Savitri to the world as it is today, the contemporary world. He didn't approach Savitri just as, either as just a mystical poem, in a world of its own, or as, something that was written 50 years ago, but as something which is relevant to us now and is relevant not just to devotees in the ashram, although of course his talks were attended mostly by devotees, but was relevant to everyone. And he gave me the idea that we've maybe been confining Sri Aurobindo too much to too small a circle. And one thing that happened during this period was that I myself had been asked to give a talk in Bangalore at a place called the Indian Institute of World Culture or something. It was just a small institute actually, but it had been founded, I think, in memory of a man who had been vice chancellor of a university, one of the universities in the South. I've forgotten. You know.
I believe I spoke there once.
Yeah,
I think
you gave one
has.
of those too. Yeah. Anyway, I was asked. Deshpande had given the previous one and recommended my name, and so this was I think 2002. I think it was 2002.
Usually on Savitri?
And
or at least mine was.
Mine, no, it wasn't actually on Savitri. That was what was different. I had, until then, I had been writing about Savitri, in Mother India. I was doing that every month. But my topic was actually, it was called The Integral Yoga and the Scientific Method. It was quite different from my writings on Savitri. And I was very conscious of the fact that I was addressing the general public for the first time, because until then I had never written or spoken really outside of the circle of Sri Aurobindo's followers. And so I took a different approach in that. And this was something which was very much encouraged by my exposure to Nadkarni and his way of presenting Sri Aurobindo. He became quite preoccupied toward the end of his life with the lack of receptivity and interest with regard to Sri Aurobindo in Indian academics, and felt that something should be done about this in one of his last articles, which was published in that book that they brought out of his writings. Had to do with the 4 categories of Indian academics who dismiss Sri Aurobindo for one reason or another. Yeah. Anyway, so that was, I think this was actually the thing that Nadkarni influenced me most to, think about of how one could, present Sri Aurobindo to a wider public. So since then I've attended a number of academic conferences which were not confined to Sri Aurobindo's followers.
And how have they received
And,
your talks?
They were received. Always been received very well. The first one was sort of transitional in the sense that it was. I can't remember now exactly what it was. It was a conference in Delhi, but it was. The whole conference was about Sri Aurobindo. I don't remember what the title of the conference was, but Manoj, I remember traveling to the conference with Manoj Das, but it was Aurobindo Basu who had recommended my name.
Oh.
Because he had been invited to attend this conference, but there was another conference in Calcutta simultaneously, which he had to attend. So he wasn't able to attend, and he had recommended me on very short notice. I had about a week, I think, to prepare a paper for this conference. It was well attended. I don't remember even what, I mean, it was well received, I meant to say. The paper that I presented, Anand Reddy was there, and Premananda Kumar, I don't remember exactly, a few people from the ashram, and a number of academics unconnected with the ashram. After that, I was at one point, well, I was asked once to speak at the Om conference. You were there. That was 2009 or something, 10?
10 maybe.
Anyway, somewhere around then.
Right in that.
By
Los Angeles or New York.
No, this was the one in upstate New York,
New York, yeah.
Which Julian organized, and he had asked me.
I think that was, yeah.
He had asked me to speak at that. That sort of came about, although I was addressing Sri Aurobindo's followers at that conference. The topic that I chose for it worked in naturally with the idea of addressing a larger audience, because I had taken a topic which had struck me. The conference was on the spiritual future of America, something about
it was about America,
something like that. Julian wanted me to speak on something that had an American connection. And I had an idea, which was that I had noticed at some point a very interesting connection between the famous Serenity Prayer
Oh, yes.
and the Yoga of Self-Perfection, the Saptachatustaya, that the three elements of the Serenity Prayer, serenity, courage, and wisdom, relate to the first three elements of the Saptachatustaya. You might remember the talk that I gave on that. So when I was preparing that, Julian encouraged me to say more about Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian who had written the Serenity Prayer.
Yes.
For a long time, it was not known actually who it was.
You did
who
a
had
paper
written
on him, did you not?
And so this was the paper.
This was the paper.
He encouraged me to look into Reinhold Niebuhr, and I found very interesting parallels with Sri Aurobindo, and so I ended up talking about Niebuhr in the first half, and then getting to Sri Aurobindo. This set a sort of pattern which I started to follow then in writing articles which introduce Sri Aurobindo, but don't start right off with Sri Aurobindo and sort of lead into Sri Aurobindo. It's a kind of pattern. I did this then for a conference in Delhi, which was sponsored by the American Institute of Jain Studies, strangely enough. But it was it was actually attended mostly by scientists on integrating science and spirituality. This came about because of my connection with the Gnostic Center.
Oh, I see.
In Delhi, I had given
Amita Mehra.
I had given a series of talks at the Gnostic Center at the invitation of Amita Mehra.
Yes.
And I went back for another series, and Anuradha at the Gnostic Center has an uncle who is a scientist, and he was the one who organized this conference. And her
Sanskrit.
mother, I think,
Very-
has a Jain background or something.
Oh.
And so he was a Jain, and organized this conference, the International Institute for Jain Studies. But most of these people were actually scientists, and it was well. So I wrote a paper called "Intuition and the Limits of Reason," in which I started with Western science and showed the role of intuition in science, and then proceeded to the intuition, in a cross-cultural context, and specifically the Indian context. There was a sort of natural link from science to India through the physicist Schrödinger, who was a Vedantist and was one of the founders of quantum physics. So I kind of this followed a similar strategy to the paper on Niebuhr and Sri Aurobindo, in that I didn't even mention, even more so in that I didn't even mention Sri Aurobindo in the beginning, but I end with Sri Aurobindo, who has, of course, more to say about intuition than anybody else who has ever written on the subject. So that worked out quite well, and again, it was an academic paper. There was nobody really connected with the ashram in the audience, but it was very well received by scientists and philosophers. And
what is your current work now in the archives?
well, I'm continuing primarily with the work of preparing editions of Sri Aurobindo's works based on his manuscripts, and particularly recently completing the publication of his unpublished works. That means in the last few years, quite a lot of previously unpublished letters have been.
Yes, Bob has been telling me that. So there are going to be four.
Have been, yeah.
Four
Now
books
that is actually finished, and the last volume is in the press.
It's in
The
press.
third has even been printed, and is available on the ashram's website, the PDF, but hasn't been released because they're waiting for another volume to come out with it. Which I think, let's see, what is it? I've forgotten exactly, but I'm just finishing Vedic and Philological Studies. I think that the third and fourth volumes of letters on yoga will be released together. That's what it is.
Oh, okay.
Shraddha likes to release 2 volumes
I see.
at least at a time. So the third volume of letters on yoga was held back until the fourth can be released. And that should be soon, because the fourth has already been in the press for quite some time. So that work on the letters is finished, but while that was going on, I was involved in not actually the transcription, which had already been done, but in reading the difficult words which the other members of the team in the archives, we have a whole team that was working on the correspondence, which they had trouble with or doubted the readings of or something. So I had somehow acquired a reputation for being the best at deciphering Sri Aurobindo's illegible handwriting. I don't know that it actually is due to any particular skill, but I think it's due to a particular tenacity that I have, that once I apply myself to a problem, I don't let it go until I solve it. And there's also something of this certain problem-solving method that I had started working on way back in my early days with math.
Yes, yes.
I think what I was doing with math, actually, although I had no idea what I was doing, was the beginnings of developing an intuitive mind. I mean, at least some glimmerings of intuition. Intuition is really the thing that interests me. I mean, it's the that I've actually given up on overmind and supermind for this now, frankly. But intuition is something that, we can at least work on. And so now intuition comes in very strongly in deciphering Sri Aurobindo's illegible handwriting, with not only because it's very difficult, but there's the additional factor that it's Sri Aurobindo's writing. So there's the possibility of opening to Sri Aurobindo's consciousness through the concentration on the manuscript. And I don't know exactly how it works, but what I do know is that after spending a few hours zeroing in on a word in the manuscript which nobody has been able to read, suddenly it flashes on me, and I don't know, exactly. One has to read the context, look at the surrounding handwriting, being familiar with Sri Aurobindo's handwriting at that particular period, because his handwriting kept changing. So there's a certain element of a kind of expertise that comes in from having worked for decades in the archives, reading Sri Aurobindo's manuscripts. But in addition, I'm fairly convinced that there's something that comes from identifying also with the consciousness behind the writing. And at a certain point it all comes together, and it just, one moment I'm still struggling with it, and then in the next moment I know what it is, and I think, what was the problem? Because once you see it, usually it's no longer illegible. I mean, some people think that maybe you're, imposing a reading, you're tired of struggling with it, and that you finally impose your own reading on. But it's not only that when I look at it, having, had this insight, that it seems obvious to me that that's what it was, but if somebody else looks at it, someone, of course, familiar with the handwriting, but others can look at it and confirm my reading.
I see.
And they invariably do when it's this kind of reading, which is...
That's a great gift.
I don't know what it is, but it's been the most interesting thing about working in the archives, I would say. The other thing, of course, is just the general exposure to Sri Aurobindo's process of revision, seeing how patiently he worked over his own writings, even when they were inspired to begin with, but he would continue, at least, in the case of not only Savitri, but the writings in the Arya, when he would revise them, the revised chapters of the Synthesis of Yoga, the revised chapters of the Life Divine. I've seen, the process by which he reworked his own writings and raised them to a new level.
As close to a perfect perfection, he says.
And he talks about that in connection with Savitri, but it's also true of the Life Divine.
Yes.
And particularly part 1 of the Synthesis of Yoga. He just never had time to do it with all of his works, and he never had time to finish the synthesis. But as far as he got, it set a kind of, it showed me what is possible in terms of the perfection that can be achieved through this process of writing, and what's involved in that, how Sri Aurobindo worked when he revised. So this is something,
And what about your poetry? Are you writing any poetry?
Oh, I realized at a certain point fairly early that I didn't have a gift for writing original poetry, but that I had something a little bit more unusual, which was a certain ability to translate poetry, which is something Sri Aurobindo was very interested in and practiced, but which has been very much neglected in general by translators. The art of poetic translation, such as it was, has fallen out of fashion. Most of what passes as poetic translation now I wouldn't call poetry at all.
No.
So I got interested in that, and most of the translation work that I did along those lines was at a fairly early stage, and it was from Sanskrit, particularly Kalidasa. I translated The Cloud Messenger, which was published in Mother India. I also translated The Seasons, which was never published. But later on, in the course of my work in the archives, I had found it necessary to learn Bengali, which came fairly easily to me because of my background in not only Sanskrit but Hindi. And so in the 90s I learned Bengali, and so I tried my hand at translating some of Sri Aurobindo's Bengali poetry, and I don't know if you've seen but a few.
I've seen a couple.
What I did there, it was a very interesting situation for a translator, because normally you're translating from the language of the writer into a language that he couldn't have written in and didn't write in. That's the normal situation in translation, or couldn't have written well in. In the case of Sri Aurobindo's Bengali poetry and his Bengali writings in general, you're translating into a language which he knew better than the language that you're translating from, if anything. I mean, he wrote good Bengali poetry, but he doesn't rank as a Bengali poet, with Tagore. I don't think any Bengali would seriously suggest that.
Right.
And it's no disrespect to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo would have been aghast if anyone had had tried to make such a comparison. But of course, he was a great poet in English. So, inspired by Sri Aurobindo's own poetry in English and his theory of translation, which encouraged me to recreate his Bengali poems as English poems, I tried my hand in translating short Bengali poems which use rhyme into rhymed lyrical poems in English, and a longer poem in the Bengali equivalent of free verse I've translated into English free verse. The only time I've written not free verse, but blank verse. Blank verse, which Sri Aurobindo always said is the most difficult to write. And I always wondered why. Well, if you try to do it, you find out why. And I remember one of the short Bengali poems I translated in a week. And I did it mostly in the evenings when I was having to do gate duty at Golconda. I had memorized the Bengali poem in Bengali, and then I was very busy, but I had this free time, and at night when I was sitting at the desk at Golconda without anything else to do, I would translate a stanza of this Bengali poem. And so I did the whole thing in a week. When I tried to do this blank verse poem, the translation ends up being 4 pages. It took me 6 months. And that was hard work. And so I think it came out well. That was the one called Mohakal in Bengali. I think I just translated under the title Time, and it was published in Mother India. The shorter Bengali poems, I can sort of, I can't really remember the Bengali. I can remember my translations. But there was a Bengali, one of the poems, it's a poem on Shiva as Nataraj. It begins, Koto shoto chondo bondhe nritya koro Nataraj ei tobo bisho majhe, something like that. It has a kind of Koto shoto chondo bondhe nritya koro Nataraj ei tobo bisho majhe, and then there's a rhyme with the majhe a couple of lines later. There's a rhyme, both a rhythm and a rhyme, and I translated it Koto shoto. It started off quite literally almost. Um, it means literally koto shoto chondo bondhe nritto koro notaraj. In how many hundreds of meters or rhythms you dance, O Lord of Dance. So I translated it, 100 rhythmed is thy dancing, Lord of Dance, and with entrancing motion fills the cosmic stage. Never ending is the series of thy forms, thy masks, nor wearies thy fantasy from age to age. So it's a sort of very loose equivalent of the meter, and has
But the rhyme.
has a somewhat similar rhyme, and it all somehow worked out. It's a very short poem. It's just a fragment which was found in a corner of a page of a notebook, one of Sri Aurobindo's notebooks, in which he wrote in three other things, I think, completely unrelated, on the same page. It was just something fragmentary that he jotted down. But it's a beautiful poem as far as it goes. I remember Pijushta at the press, with whom I worked on Sri Aurobindo's Bengali writings, the edition which is now published. He called my attention to this particular poem. It was a favorite of his, and so I looked at it and thought, yeah, that's that's a beautiful poem. Anyway, so that's. I had actually written a short series of articles on Sri Aurobindo's theory of translation. This is something which I don't think anybody had ever done. Somebody had actually asked me to write for a book that never came together, I don't think. It was Vishwanath Roy from Calcutta. He asked me to write on for a book he was planning, which I don't think was ever published, but I think there was a Bengali volume that was published, and the English one never materialized or something. But meanwhile, I had written about Sri Aurobindo's theory of translation, which is very fascinating. In his article on translating Kalidasa, he had written on the theory of translation. It was a good, even though it was a very early writing of his, it was a good contribution to a very difficult topic of theory of translation.
I think very few still read The Future of Poetry. I don't know many people who read that, but it's a favorite book.
It's a wonderful book, yeah.
Yes.
My whole interest in poetry really came from reading The Future Poetry, along, of course, with Savitri. But I started to read English poetry after reading The Future Poetry. I remember reading a little bit in high school without even reading it as poetry. I remember reading, as rhythmic and lyrical a poet as Coleridge, almost as if it was prose. And I read Shakespeare without any understanding of the meter in those days. And I noticed nowadays that actors, in televised productions of Shakespeare sometimes seem to not know the meter.
Very true. Very true. Richard, in closing, would you recite a few lines from Savitri? Your choice.
I don't know where to. Well, let me. I'll just do a few lines.
Sure.
Let me say a little bit then about just a little bit about memorization of Savitri. I'm not actively working on this at present, and I do need to refresh my memory, not for the individual lines in most cases, but for the sequence of lines, and particularly the connections.
Yes.
If I try to recite by heart a passage that I haven't reviewed recently, I may leave lines out.
I found the same thing.
or in certain passages you can get them in the wrong order or something like that. The individual lines are easy to remember because of the rhythm and the sound, unless occasionally there are two words with this that would fit in the same rhythm and have the same meaning. But mostly, you know, unknown and unseen, the sound, general sound is fairly similar, and the rhythm is the same. But generally, individual lines are easy to remember. It's the sequence that's hard to remember whole. But one of my favorite things to do has been to learn whole cantos of Savitri by heart and recite them with my eyes closed, because I find that I get a more powerful experience of Savitri with my eyes closed. But of course, for that you have to learn it by heart.
I did the first 3 cantos of Book 1.
In that way.
Memorized.
Memorized,
yes.
yeah.
But unless you keep it up.
Yeah, you have to keep it up. I at one time learned the whole of Part 1. And I probably at that point had learned maybe 2/3 of. I don't mean that at any one time I was capable of reciting the whole of Part 1, but I had learned all the cantos. And I find this is extremely valuable. Let me just take the beginning of the 4th canto, The Secret Knowledge. Just a little bit of it.
My favorite.
On a height, sorry, let me say also, I always have a hard time getting started reciting Savitri, because it's a whole different consciousness. And it's to make the transition from ordinary speech to reciting Savitri. This will only be a couple minutes at the most. Since we're going past the time that I expected, I might as well just mention one thing. This is a very curious thing that I've done. During the time when I was memorizing a lot of Savitri, an idea came to me for improving my memory. A very strange idea. I was at this time doing a little bit of computer programming. One Christmas day, I thought of giving a present to myself, and I wrote a computer program which randomly selected lines from Savitri and asked me to identify where it is. Book, canto, and if possible, page number. I soon found that in most cases I was able to identify the exact page number of most of the randomly selected lines, because I had memorized enough of Savitri and I sort of knew roughly where the page breaks were. So for years the first thing I used to do when I arrived at the archives was to sit down and play my Savitri game and just test my memory. And it was a very interesting thing. I've stopped doing it for a while. But still very often if someone asks me about a passage in Savitri, I can tell them, oh, that's on page such and such. And it's kind of a nice relationship to have with Savitri. I never, fully perfected that.
I don't know how Jugal did it, but I was told that he could give you any page of all of Sri Aurobindo's writings.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know how he did it. I only knew him briefly, but
anyway,
he had that knowledge.
This wasn't any siddhi, it was just a normal development of memory I was using. Well, I was sort of consciously cultivating the memory, and I thought this was an interesting way to do it. So, let me just recite a little bit of the Secret Knowledge, Book 1, Canto 4 of Savitri. On a height he stood that looked towards greater heights. Our early approaches to the infinite, our sunrise splendors on a marvelous verge, while lingers yet unseen the glorious sun. What now we see is a shadow of what must come. The earth's uplook to a remote unknown is a preface only of the epic climb of human soul from its flat earthly state to the discovery of a greater self and the far gleam of an eternal light. This world is a beginning and a base. A death-bound littleness is not all we are. Immortal our forgotten vastnesses await discovery in our summit selves. Unmeasured breadths and depths of being are ours. To these high-peaked dominions sealed to our search, too far from surface nature's postal routes, too lofty for our mortal lives to breathe, deep in us a forgotten kinship points, and a faint voice of ecstasy and prayer calls to those lucent, lost immensities.
Thank you so much. Very special. A great blessing for me.
Thank you.